Good day, everybody, except for fans of the Dallas Mavericks basketball team, because over the weekend you traded Luka Doncic in what could only be described as one of the craziest, most shocking trades literally in the history of professional sports. But that aside, why would someone like me, registered dietitian with a master's degree in kinesiology, why would someone like me decide to spend 11 or 12 minutes on a video talking about this trade? Well, that would be because of the reasons that were given, or perhaps more accurately, should I say, the allegations that are out there to explain why the Dallas Mavericks traded Luka Doncic. I'm going to show you one clip that I took off the World Wide Web, and I'll read it out to you. Details are emerging about the Dallas Mavericks' frustrations with Luka Doncic. The Mavs appear to have serious concerns about Doncic's conditioning as well as the star's weight. It was reported that Dallas believes Doncic's diet and lack of conditioning were major factors in the star's recent string of injuries. The Mavericks were motivated to move Doncic because of his constant conditioning concerns. There had been significant frustration within the organization about Doncic's lack of discipline regarding his diet and conditioning, which team services considered a major factor in his injury issues. So as you see, those things are squarely within the area of expertise of someone like me with a background in sports nutritional sciences. And so considering such, I got to tell you, I thought maybe there was like a niche I could occupy. Maybe I could fill a void. I could play the devil's advocate and put forth the argument as to why this does make sense that the Dallas Mavericks could trade this player for these reasons. Because I got to tell you, if you search in the media, there's almost unanimous agreement among, people that like know basketball or other media types. They are unanimous in their belief that this is not a good trade for the Dallas Mavericks. So maybe I could be the one to put forth the argument, the contrary side of this. The only problem is I cannot. There's a scientific word for this type of trade, and that word is stupid. But maybe what I can do is provide a little bit of insight, hopefully some interesting and entertaining insight, as to what exactly makes this trade so stupid, assuming that these are, in fact, legitimate reasons why Doncic got traded, and there's not something else going on. But maybe I could take my skills, my background in nutritional sports science, and explain why this trade does not make sense. So here goes. I would begin the argument by stating the following sentence. As the complexity of any given sport increases, you will find an inverse relationship with the contribution that nutrition is likely to make to the performance of said sport. So in other words, what I'm saying is this. As the sport gets more and more, I use the word complicated, the skill set is more specific. As that increases, the contribution or the importance of nutrition toward that sport comes down. Now, if you're not following what I'm saying, let's go through a little bit of an exercise to make this point clearer. And the exercise that I often find is instructive is if we examine the extremes of the spectrum in which I'm talking about with this complexity in sports. Here's how I would begin. I'd say with a fair degree of confidence, it is possible to stratify all the different sports that were ever created by human beings based on their level of complexity. The way in which you do this, roughly speaking, is you first of all determine the number of variables that are in play. You then qualify how difficult those variables are from a skill mastery point of view. And I'm quite confident, like I said, you could create a hierarchy of sports being really complicated, coming down the ladder to ones that are not so complicated. And let's examine those types of sports at the edges of the continuum. I'll give you two at the bottom end of this continuum or this hierarchy of complexity. And as my proposed relationship would tell you, these are sports that nutrition really, really makes a big difference toward. Example number one. Let's talk about the sport of bodybuilding. And with all due respect to the bodybuilders of the world, really, the sport is as simple as the creation of skeletal muscle tissue in certain strategically arranged places for the purposes of aesthetics. But really, folks, it's a laboratory experiment in many, many ways. You don't do it in the laboratory. You do it by pushing and pulling heavy things. But those are not incredibly complex techniques or motions to master. I grant there's form is important and whatnot. But to compare it to the kind of sport like Luka Doncic plays, I think we have to agree the level of complexity in the sport of bodybuilding is at the very lower end of this continuum that I'm talking about. And as a result, we find nutrition makes an enormously important role in this sport. Put it this way, let's, for argument's sake, do a thought exercise. Pretend bodybuilding was a team sport in the same way that basketball is a team sport. There wouldn't be talk like this of a bodybuilder being traded for his bad diet, because no bodybuilder could have a bad diet and be at the highest level of his sport. If you find a bodybuilder with a bad diet is just some other random dude who goes to the gym. It's crucial in this sport. It's imperative to get your nutrition right. Here's a second example if you're still not buying what I'm saying. Different type of sport entirely. However, I'd argue also very low on the complexity hierarchy, and therefore nutrition plays an enormous role in this sport. And the sport I'm going to give you is marathon running. Again, I know many marathon runners. I love you all, but I think you'd have to agree with me. Relative to the other sports created by human beings, your sport is fairly straightforward. You have to run 26 miles as fast as you can. And I get there's strategy, there's pacing. But again, for the sake of argument, I don't think any marathon runners are practicing the technique of running. The name of this game is, again, an exercise in physiology, namely endurance physiology. And if that's the name of the game, you had better be certain that you are appropriately fueled for your sport. Again, folks, I think there are no elite marathon runners who have bad diets. You must fuel yourself properly to get through 26 miles at an elite pace. If you get the nutrition wrong in that sport, I'm on board. And it's not even an argument, because the athlete is simply not going to rise to the highest possible levels. So those are my two examples of sports on the lower end of what I'll call, again, the complexity hierarchy, and therefore nutrition being really, really important towards those sports. But what about Luka Doncic's sport? I might suggest that the sport of basketball is almost at the very top of the most demanding, highest skill of all the sports ever created by human beings. Not quite number one, maybe. There's maybe one number one that's my own personal favorite sport. But basketball is really, really high up there. And if you're not buying what I'm saying here, let's take a step back for a second. Again, another little thought exercise. Pretend you never heard of basketball. You have no idea what the sport is, and someone's going to explain it to you. I'll explain three things in the sport of basketball that I think you'll have to agree are just super, super peculiar, specific skills to this sport. Number one, okay, we're going to give you a ball in this sport. That's great. Lots of sports have balls. Do I carry it? Do I kick it? Nope. You've got to bounce this particular ball on the floor. I've got to bounce it. You can't run with it. You've got to maneuver the ball down the court by bouncing it up and down on the floor. It sounds kind of peculiar. And of course, when you see some of these high levels, they look like magicians the way they can bounce the ball. But out of context, that's a really odd skill. And I ask you, what role do you think nutrition has in developing the skill of bouncing a basketball? I would humbly suggest not very much. The only thing that develops dribbling skills is dribbling. Now, don't get me wrong, diet always makes a difference for the sake of just being overall healthy. But we're talking sport specifics here, right? And I'm going to suggest that dribbling a basketball is a very peculiar, specific sport skill that you only get by practicing the sport. How about number two here? Again, out of context. Think about this. I'm going to explain to you. There's a hoop that's 18 inches in diameter, and I'm going to hang it 10 feet in the air. And you've got to take a ball, and you've got to throw the ball up into the air, judge the trajectory, and have it land through this hoop. You'd pause and you'd say, that sounds really, really weird. How on earth would one develop that skill? Little to do with pure exercise physiology, I might suggest. And because of that, less to do with nutrition or your weight, like the Dallas Mavericks would suggest. A lot to do with practice, repetition, neuromuscular connections, spatial awareness. But those things are not heavily nutrition dependent. I promised you a third one, and this is the most complicated of them all, actually. And I won't go into too much detail, but suffice to say, anyone who knows the sport of basketball, if I said to you the term basketball IQ, you'd know what I mean. But just to summarize for people that don't know the sport so much, so folks, you're on a court with four other teammates that you're trying to work together with as one unit of five, but there's five different brains, and you've got to read, if my teammate's over there and he's over there, where do we go? Where do I stand? Very, very complicated. Never mind the fact there's five other people who are your opponents who are literally getting in the way of what you're trying to do. Folks, this is a mental game. Very little to do with nutrition. Would basketball IQ have to do with? So those are three reasons why the sport of basketball is a really, really highly specific skill sport, and therefore maybe not so susceptible to the whims of nutritional science. Back to Luka Doncic. How good of a basketball player really is Luka Doncic? You heard me describe these three different basketball skills. I won't try to qualitatively describe to you how good of a basketball player Luka Doncic is. I won't try to qualitatively describe to you how well he's mastered all these different skills. I'll just throw some stats at you. How about this? If you were to look up the number of players in the history of the NBA who made the NBA first team at the end of the year, so the best five players in the league at their positions, under the age of 25, the guy who did it the most is named LeBron James. The number two guy of all time is Luka Doncic. How about a second stat? If you were to list the all-time leading scorers in points per game average in NBA history, you'd find two names at the top, One is Jordan. The second is Chamberlain. The third is Luka Doncic. So this is clearly an enormously skilled basketball player. Why the hell you'd be concerned about what he's eating? If I may use my hierarchy example again, this is very low on the hierarchy of what I would be concerned about with a basketball player this good. One more stat just to throw at you. Maybe you might say, oh, that's great. He's great in the regular season, but maybe he's not mentally strong and he can't get it done when the games matter the most. But that would be wrong as well because the Dallas Mavericks made the NBA Finals last season. So, given my background in sports science and nutrition, I am really inclined to try to defend those types of things, even champion their importance. But in the case of the Luka Doncic trade, I really just can't. In fact, I'm inclined to go the other way and say this would be a really good example, if the allegations are true, as this is the reason why they traded him, as it being an example of a misuse of sport science. And in conclusion, let me leave you with two books that were really, really influential for me personally in developing this kind of a thought about the misuse of science. One is a great sports book, an oldie but a goodie, written in the 1980s by a guy named John Jerome, called The Sweet Spot in Time, The Search for Athletic Perfection. And in this book, there's a quote that I've said many, many times, which is as follows. With rumors of science, all sorts of horrors became possible. And I think for Dallas Mavericks fans, trading Luka Doncic would be classified as a horrific event. And the second book is an even older one, but maybe even a gooder one. Certainly one of my all-time favorite novels because, folks, I'm a great fan of the genre known as science fiction. And in 1818, a young girl named Mary Shelley basically invented the genre of science fiction when she wrote this book called Frankenstein. And don't get me wrong, it has its place in entertainment, but when you apply it to the world of sports, well, like John Jerome said, horrific things can result. Abominations, if you will, like the trade of Luka Doncic, a horrific abomination. Or maybe the best term of all, sport, science, fiction.